The morning sun cast long shadows across Nagasaki as people went about their daily routines. Children played in the streets while adults hurried to work in the bustling industrial district. Few could have imagined that this ordinary Tuesday would become one of history's most devastating days. When air raid sirens pierced the morning calm, residents dutifully sought shelter. But when the all-clear sounded shortly after, they emerged believing the danger had passed. Japanese spotters had seen only 2 American bombers, hardly enough for a major attack. They assumed it was just another reconnaissance flight. What happened next defied human comprehension. At exactly 11 minutes past 11 in the morning, a single bomb fell from the sky. In an instant, the world changed forever. The explosion unleashed the power of 22,000 tons of dynamite in one blinding flash. The fireball burned hotter than the surface of the sun, reaching nearly 4,000 degrees. Winds stronger than any hurricane, 600 miles per hour, tore through the city like an invisible monster, flattening everything in their path. The light was so brilliant that people 100 miles away saw it clearly. In the center of the blast, human shadows were burned permanently into concrete walls, the only trace left of those who stood there moments before. Buildings melted like candles, steel twisted into impossible shapes. At least 129,000 people died that day, or in the terrible weeks that followed. Many more would suffer for years from mysterious illnesses that doctors barely understood. The lucky ones died quickly. 6 days later, Japan surrendered. The most destructive war in human history had finally ended, but it concluded with humanity's first glimpse into its own potential for total destruction. To understand how the world descended into such madness, we must travel back to a small Austrian town where a failed artist named Adolf Hitler nursed his bitter dreams. Born in Austria but fighting for Germany in the First Great War, Hitler felt personally humiliated when his adopted country was crushed and forced to accept harsh peace terms. Unlike many Europeans who feared another war, Hitler feared something else entirely: the spread of communist ideas from revolutionary Russia. In 1919, still angry about Germany's defeat, he joined a tiny political group called the German Workers' Party. His gift for stirring crowds with passionate speeches quickly made him their most valuable member. Within a year, the group renamed itself the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The Nazis. Hitler's magnetic personality and fiery speeches drew more and more followers to their cause. By 1921, he had become their leader, convinced that destiny had chosen him to restore Germany's greatness. In 1923, drunk on their growing popularity, the Nazis tried to seize power in Munich. The attempt failed miserably, and Hitler found himself in prison. But even this setback worked in his favor. His trial became a stage for his ideas, winning him even more supporters across Germany. During his year in prison, Hitler wrote his autobiography, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. This book became more than just his life story. It was a blueprint for the nightmare that would follow. In its pages, Hitler blamed Germany's problems on a vast conspiracy led by Jews and communists. He claimed these groups had deliberately weakened Germany through treaties and economic warfare. The book painted a picture of the German people as a superior race, the Aryans, who deserved to rule over others. Hitler positioned himself as their destined leader, the one who would guide them to their rightful place as masters of Europe. By 1933, enough Germans believed his message that Hitler legally became chancellor. Once in power, he moved quickly to transform Germany into his vision of a perfect state. The swastika became the symbol of this new Germany, and persecution of Jews, Roma people, and political opponents became official government policy. While most history books mark 1939 as the beginning of World War II, the truth is more complex. Some historians now argue the war actually began in 1931, when Japan invaded Manchuria in China. The Japanese military deliberately bombed their own railway line, then blamed Chinese rebels for the attack. This false flag operation gave them the excuse they needed to invade and occupy Chinese territory. For 14 years, until Japan's final defeat in 1945, the Chinese people endured unimaginable suffering under Japanese rule. The Japanese occupation was marked by widespread cruelty. Rape and murder became commonplace, often encouraged by Japanese commanders. In a secret facility called Unit 731, Thousands of Chinese civilians became unwilling subjects in horrific medical experiments. Doctors performed surgery without pain relief, tested biological weapons on living people, and conducted other procedures too terrible to describe in detail. Meanwhile, in Italy, another dictator was rising to power. Benito Mussolini and his fascist party had taken control in 1922, gradually transforming Italy from a democracy into a dictatorship centered around Mussolini's personality. Like Hitler, Mussolini believed his country had a glorious destiny to rebuild the Roman Empire. In 1935, Mussolini sent his armies into Ethiopia, beginning his dream of an African empire. The world watched as modern Italian forces, equipped with poison gas and aircraft, overwhelmed Ethiopian defenders, armed mainly with spears and outdated rifles. Back in Germany, Hitler was carefully testing how far he could push the victorious powers of World War I. In 1935, he openly began rebuilding Germany's military, directly violating the peace treaty that had ended the previous war. Britain and France protested, but did nothing. Encouraged by their weakness, Hitler ordered German troops into the Rhineland in 1936. This region had been declared a demilitarized zone to protect France from future German aggression. Hitler secretly told his generals to retreat immediately if they met any French resistance, knowing Germany was still too weak to fight a real war. But again, France and Britain did nothing but complain. Hitler's gamble had paid off spectacularly. In 1937, British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin stepped down, replaced by Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain believed he could negotiate with Hitler and avoid another devastating war. This belief would prove tragically wrong. Hitler now set his sights on Austria, his birth country. Although the peace treaty forbade any union between Germany and Austria, Hitler's propaganda machine began spreading stories about Austrians begging to join the new Germany. In March 1938, German troops marched into Austria, claiming they were restoring order. Within weeks, Austria had disappeared, absorbed into Hitler's growing empire. Next came Czechoslovakia. Hitler claimed he was protecting ethnic Germans living in the Sudetenland region. A series of meetings between Germany, Britain, and France resulted in the Munich Agreement, which essentially gave Hitler everything he wanted. Tragically, no Czech representatives were even invited to these discussions about their own country's fate. Chamberlain returned to Britain, waiving the agreement, claiming he had secured peace for our time. Within months, Hitler had seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, proving that his promises meant nothing. Hitler's aggression worried Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, who ruled Russia with paranoid brutality. In his book Mein Kampf, Hitler had written that fighting on two fronts had doomed Germany in the previous war. Determined not to repeat this mistake, Hitler began secret negotiations with Stalin. In August 1939, German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop met with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov in Moscow. These two representatives of supposedly opposing ideologies carved up Eastern Europe between their masters. The Soviet Union would get Eastern Poland and Finland, while Germany would take the West. This agreement shocked the world. Nazi Germany and Communist Russia were supposed to be bitter enemies. Yet here they were, dividing up their neighbors like pieces of a pie. On September 1st, 1939, German forces poured across the Polish border. This time, Britain and France could not ignore Hitler's aggression. They delivered an ultimatum: withdraw from Poland or face war. Hitler refused. On September 3rd, Prime Minister Chamberlain's voice crackled over British radio. "This country is at war with Germany." But Germany's generals had warned Hitler that the country wasn't ready for a major European war. Their rearmament plans assumed war wouldn't come until 1945, by which time they would have aircraft carriers, massive submarine fleets, and overwhelming tank forces. Faced with this reality, German military leaders developed a new strategy: blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This approach used tanks and aircraft working together to punch through enemy lines, capture key positions, and divide enemy forces before they could organize effective resistance. Speed was everything. Germany needed quick victories because it couldn't sustain a long war. Poland became the first victim of this new warfare. In less than a month, the Polish army was destroyed. On September 17th, as agreed, Soviet forces invaded eastern Poland. By October 6th, Poland had ceased to exist as an independent nation. Britain and France's declaration of war sent shockwaves across Europe, but for months, very little actual fighting occurred. This period became known as the Phony War because both sides seemed to be preparing for battle without actually fighting. France mobilized its forces and sent them to the German border, while Britain created the British Expeditionary Force to support them. At sea, German submarines began sinking merchant ships, and British aircraft dropped leaflets over German cities. But major combat remained limited. One dramatic exception occurred in the South Atlantic, where the German pocket battleship Graf Spee was hunting British merchant vessels. 3 British cruisers finally cornered the German ship and damaged it enough to force it into the neutral port of Montevideo for repairs. While the Graf Spee sat in port, British intelligence spread rumours that a massive British fleet was gathering to destroy it. The German captain, believing he faced impossible odds, chose to scuttle his own ship rather than fight. In reality, no such fleet existed, but the deception saved thousands of lives. The Phony War ended abruptly on May 10, 1940, when Germany struck west. Hitler's forces swept through Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands before turning toward France. The famous Maginot Line, France's supposedly impregnable border fortification, proved useless because Hitler simply went around it. The German advance was devastating. Despite being outnumbered on paper, German forces used superior tactics and coordination to overwhelm the Allies. The Luftwaffe's Stuka dive bombers became symbols of terror, fitted with sirens that created a horrifying howl as they attacked. French morale collapsed as quickly as their defenses. Within weeks, it became clear that France would fall. Britain began planning Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of British forces from the French port of Dunkirk. What followed became one of the war's most famous episodes. Hundreds of small boats, fishing vessels, pleasure craft, even rowboats, crossed the English Channel to rescue trapped soldiers from Dunkirk's beaches. German air attacks inflicted heavy casualties, but for the first time, the Luftwaffe faced serious opposition from British fighters flying from nearby bases. Over 6 days, an incredible 398,000 men were rescued. While Britain celebrated this miracle, Churchill warned that wars are not won by evacuations. The British Army had lost most of its equipment and 68,000 men. A largely forgotten tragedy occurred during this period when the ocean liner Lancastria was bombed while evacuating British civilians from France. Between 3,000 and 6,000 people died, making it the worst maritime disaster in British history, worse than the Titanic. The government covered up the disaster to protect morale. On June 25, 1940, after just 46 days of fighting, France surrendered. Hitler had achieved what the Kaiser had failed to do in 4 years of World War I. France was divided, with Germany occupying the north and a puppet government controlling the south. With France defeated, Hitler faced the question of what to do about Britain. He actually preferred not to destroy the British Empire, fearing it would only benefit America. He offered peace terms, but Churchill refused, even though Britain's chances of surviving a German invasion seemed slim. Hitler ordered his generals to plan Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. But first, they would need to destroy the Royal Air Force. German troops crossing the English Channel would be sitting ducks if British aircraft could attack them. On July 10, 1940, the Battle of Britain began. The German Luftwaffe launched a massive air offensive to destroy British air power. However, unlike their previous campaigns, the Germans now faced a well-organized defense system centered around Fighter Command, led by Sir Hugh Dowding. The British had 2 excellent fighter aircraft, the Hawker Hurricane and the more advanced Supermarine Spitfire. Their ranks were filled not just with British pilots, but volunteers from across the Commonwealth and occupied Europe, including experienced Polish and Czech pilots. For weeks, the battle raged in the skies over Britain. The RAF was taking heavy losses, and by September, Fighter Command was at its weakest point. But then Hitler made a crucial mistake. After British bombers accidentally hit Berlin, an enraged Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to stop attacking airfields and instead bomb British cities. He believed terror attacks would break British morale and force Churchill to surrender. This decision saved the RAF. While German bombers pounded London and other cities, Fighter Command rebuilt and reorganized. By the time Hitler realized his mistake, summer was ending, the weather was worsening, and Britain's defenses had grown too strong for invasion. The European war quickly spread to other continents. Italy's entry into the war gave Mussolini the chance to attack British territories in Africa from Italian colonies in Libya, Ethiopia, and Somaliland. Egypt was particularly important to Britain because of the Suez Canal, which connected Britain to its Far Eastern Empire and Middle Eastern oil supplies. In September 1940, Italian forces invaded Egypt from Libya. Initially, the Italians made good progress, but when fresh British and Commonwealth troops arrived under Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor, the situation changed dramatically. In just 2 months, British forces advanced 500 miles, destroyed 10 Italian divisions, and captured 130,000 prisoners, along with over 1,000 tanks and artillery pieces. Concerned about Italian failures, Hitler sent German forces to North Africa under the command of Erwin Rommel. Rommel was a brilliant tank commander who understood desert warfare better than most generals. He quickly pushed British forces back to the Egyptian border, though he failed to capture the vital port of Tobruk, which held out for 240 days. With invasion of Britain impossible, Hitler turned to medieval siege tactics. He ordered his navy to cut off Britain's vital supply lines from the Empire and North America. German submarines, U-boats, began a campaign to starve Britain into submission. The Royal Navy was still the world's most powerful surface fleet, but German U-boats could avoid direct confrontation while picking off merchant ships. Britain organized merchant vessels into convoys for protection and converted fishing boats into submarine hunters. But losses mounted steadily. Churchill later admitted that U-boats were the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. The submarines needed help finding convoys, so the Luftwaffe used long-range Condor aircraft to guide them to targets. Britain developed innovative solutions, including camships, merchant vessels equipped with catapults to launch a single Hurricane fighter at attacking aircraft. It was a one-way mission. The pilot had to ditch in the ocean and hope to be rescued. The development of radar technology eventually turned the tide. U-boats had to surface at night to charge their batteries, making them vulnerable to radar-equipped aircraft. By late 1941, U-boats could be attacked anywhere, anytime. Mussolini's desire to prove himself as Hitler's equal led to another disastrous campaign. In October 1940, Italian forces attacked Greece, expecting an easy victory. Instead, Greek forces not only stopped the invasion, but pushed the Italians back into Albania. This embarrassment forced Hitler to intervene. He demanded that Yugoslavia and Bulgaria allow German forces to pass through their territory to attack Greece. Bulgaria agreed, and initially so did Yugoslavia. However, a military coup in Yugoslavia rejected the alliance with Germany. Enraged, Hitler ordered the simultaneous invasion of both Yugoslavia and Greece on April 6, 1941. Yugoslavia fell in just over a week, and Greece surrendered 2 weeks later. British forces retreated to the island of Crete. Hitler then ordered the first major airborne invasion in history, the assault on Crete beginning May 20th. German paratroopers eventually captured the island after fierce fighting, but the casualties were so heavy that Hitler never again ordered a large-scale airborne operation. By mid-1941, Nazi Germany seemed unstoppable. Hitler had defeated every enemy except Britain, and Rommel was pushing British forces back in North Africa. It was at this moment of apparent triumph that Hitler made the decision that would ultimately doom his empire. Despite warnings from his generals, Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union. He believed the Soviet army was incompetent after its poor performance against Finland in 1939–40. "We only have to kick in the front door," he declared, "and the whole rotten Russian structure will come tumbling down." His generals argued for finishing off Britain first, pointing out that Germany was already fighting on multiple fronts. But Hitler was impatient and convinced of his own genius. On June 22, 1941, at 3:30 in the morning, Germany launched the largest military operation in history. Operation Barbarossa involved 3.8 million personnel attacking across a 1,800-mile front. Romanian, Finnish, and Hungarian forces joined the assault. The initial success was staggering. The Soviet Air Force was largely destroyed on the ground, and Soviet armies collapsed under the German onslaught. Stalin, unable to believe the attack was happening, retreated into shocked silence, leaving his government paralyzed. German forces advanced across Poland, Belarus, the Baltic states, Ukraine, and into Russia itself. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers surrendered as their command structure collapsed. Behind the advancing armies, German death squads began the systematic murder of Jews and other undesirables. But the vast distances proved a logistical nightmare. German forces repeatedly had to halt their advance while supplies caught up. As winter approached, German troops found themselves ill-equipped for the brutal Russian cold, wearing summer uniforms in sub-zero temperatures. By December 1941, German forces were within sight of Moscow, but they could advance no further. The Soviet Union had moved its weapons factories beyond German bomber range and was receiving supplies from Britain via dangerous Arctic convoys. Hitler now faced exactly what he had warned against in Mein Kampf: a war on multiple fronts. Germany was fighting Britain in the west, British Commonwealth forces in North Africa, and the Soviet Union in the east. As German soldiers froze in the Russian winter, far away in the tropical Pacific, a Japanese fleet was approaching the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Japan had been planning this attack for months, believing that a devastating surprise strike would cripple American naval power and force the United States to accept Japanese dominance in the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor in a carefully coordinated attack. In less than 2 hours, they sank or damaged 18 American warships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and killed over 2,400 Americans. The attack achieved tactical surprise, but proved a strategic disaster for Japan. Instead of demoralizing America, it united the country in fury. President Franklin Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy, and Congress declared war on Japan with only one dissenting vote. Hitler, bound by his alliance with Japan, declared war on the United States 4 days later. This decision brought the world's greatest industrial power into the war against Germany, sealing the fate of the Axis powers. What followed were years of brutal fighting across the globe. The war reached its peak of destruction in 1942–43, with massive battles at Stalingrad, Midway, El Alamein, and Guadalcanal. Slowly, the tide began to turn against the Axis powers. The Soviet Union, despite suffering enormous casualties, began pushing German forces back. American industrial might began to tell, producing ships, aircraft, and weapons faster than the Axis could destroy them. In North Africa, British forces finally defeated Rommel, and Allied forces invaded Italy. The war's turning point came with the D-Day landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944. Allied forces opened a second front in Western Europe, forcing Germany to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. As Soviet forces advanced from the east and Allied forces from the west, Nazi Germany was slowly crushed between them. By early 1945, Germany's defeat was inevitable. Soviet forces were fighting in the streets of Berlin, while Allied forces crossed the Rhine. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet soldiers closed in on his bunker, Adolf Hitler committed suicide, finally ending his dream of a 1,000-year Reich. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, but the war in the Pacific continued. Japan, despite facing certain defeat, refused to surrender. American forces prepared for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan itself, which military planners estimated would cost over 1 million Allied casualties. It was to avoid this bloodbath that President Harry Truman authorized the use of a terrible new weapon. On August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb Little Boy destroyed Hiroshima. 3 days later, Fat Man devastated Nagasaki. Between the two bombs and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, Japan finally surrendered on August 15, 1945. World War II was over, but the world had been forever changed. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Between 70 and 85 million people died in World War II, roughly 3% of the world's population. The Soviet Union alone lost 27 million people. 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. Along with millions of other victims of Nazi genocide, entire cities were reduced to rubble. Ancient cultures were nearly wiped out. The war introduced new horrors: industrial-scale genocide, strategic bombing of civilians, and finally, nuclear weapons that could destroy entire cities in seconds. But from this darkness came important lessons. The United Nations was founded to prevent future wars. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights established basic protections for all people. The Nuremberg trials established that following orders was no excuse for war crimes. World War II wasn't just a conflict between nations, it was a battle between different ideas about how human beings should live. On one side stood those who believed in racial superiority, authoritarian rule, and the right of the strong to dominate the weak. On the other stood those who, despite their own flaws and contradictions, believed in human dignity, democracy, and the rule of law. The war showed both the worst and best of humanity. It revealed how quickly civilization could collapse into barbarism, but also how ordinary people could show extraordinary courage when faced with evil. Understanding this history helps us recognize the warning signs when democracy is threatened, when hatred is used to divide people, and when leaders claim that some groups are less human than others. The price of freedom, as the saying goes, is eternal vigilance. The veterans of World War II are now in their late 90s or have passed away. Soon there will be no living witnesses to these events. That makes it more important than ever to preserve their stories and learn from their experiences. If you found this journey through history compelling, please hit that like button to help others discover these crucial stories. Share this video with friends and family. These lessons from the past are too important to forget. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. Your support helps us continue bringing you the human stories behind the headlines of history. Together, we can ensure that the sacrifices of those who fought for freedom are never forgotten.